Ladies and gentlemen, history is not written only by those who take power. It is written just as much by those who watch it happen and say nothing. And today's eyes of the world are fixed on Gaza City. When we speak of Israel's plan to take over Gaza City, the temptation is to frame it purely in the language of geopolitics, as if this were simply a matter of military maneuvering, strategic advantage, and territorial control. But to leave it there would be to strip the event of its deeper human significance. The surface of history is always crowded with movements of armies, with lines redrawn on maps, with leaders issuing declarations. But underneath that surface, in the bedrock where values live, something more profound is taking place. The question is not merely what is happening, but what it means, and not just for those immediately involved, but for the entire framework of moral order upon which we all depend. When a city changes hands, it is not just a shift of power from one flag to another. A city is not merely bricks and streets and infrastructure. It is a living symbol. It holds the memories, the traditions, and the struggles of the people who have inhabited it. It is part of the identity of its residents. To seize it is to alter. More than political boundaries, it is to redefine the psychological and cultural boundaries that govern how human beings understand themselves and their place in the world. That is why, when a nation decides to take possession of such a place, the moral implications reverberate far beyond the limits of the battlefield. This is why the eyes of the world are drawn to Gaza City right now. Whether people realize it or not, they are reacting not only to a military operation, but to a challenge to the shared moral language of our civilization. Across history, we have seen that the way we handle moments like this, where raw power meets contested identity, determines whether we preserve that moral language or corrupt it beyond recognition. Because in the end, a city is not just real estate. It is a repository of meaning. Meaning is fragile. The plan to take over Gaza City raises questions that are as old as civilization itself. Who has the right to decide the fate of a people? What principles justify the use of overwhelming force? When, if ever, does strategic necessity override moral restraint? These are not abstract philosophical curiosities. They're urgent, tangible questions that shape the way the world perceives the legitimacy of political action, and the way we answered them today will echo in the way they are answered tomorrow. And in the decades to come, it is here that the deeper moral architecture comes into focus. Every society operates on unspoken agreements about what is acceptable and what is not. These agreements form the scaffolding of trust between nations. And when they are broken, or even perceived to be broken, the scaffolding starts to weaken. The taking of a city, then, is never just about securing ground. It is about testing the strength of those unspoken agreements and revealing whether they still hold in the face of ambition and power when a nation moves to take control of a city. We must understand that such an act is never confined to the realm of physical geography. Maps may change overnight, lines shifted, colors altered, but the deeper transformation occurs in the realm of meaning. Territory in the strict sense is only the outer shell of something much more significant. Beneath that shell lies the intertwined reality of culture, memory, and human identity. To seize territory is to claim, intentionally or not, a degree of authorship over the story of the people who inhabit it. Gaza City is not simply a collection of streets, markets, and government buildings. It is a living narrative. It holds the accumulated weight of generations, the homes built and rebuilt, the traditions passed down in whispers and songs, the private sorrows and public celebrations that make a place into a homeland. When Israel declares its intent to take over this city, it is not just moving soldiers into position. It is attempting to alter the relationship between the land and the people. Such an act redefines the psychological space as much as the political one, because it asserts a new reality, a new claim about who belongs, who governs, and whose vision for the future will be imposed upon the physical landscape. History teaches us that territorial conquest, even when justified in the language of security or necessity, always sends a message about the nature of power. It says implicitly, control belongs to those who can take it and hold it. That message does not stay contained within the immediate conflict. It is heard and absorbed by other nations, by leaders and movements elsewhere, each of whom measures what is permissible by observing what is possible. The capture of a city thus becomes a kind of precedent, a demonstration of what the world will tolerate, what it will condemn, and what it will ignore. In this sense, the act is not simply tactical. It reshapes the moral geography as much as the physical one. By redrawing the boundary lines on a map, Israel would be simultaneously redrawing the invisible boundaries of what is considered acceptable conduct in the exercise of state power. Those boundaries are delicate. They depend not just on military might, but on the shared belief that some lines cannot be crossed without a cost. If the taking of Gaza City happens without a serious reckoning over those boundaries, the precedent set will echo well beyond this particular conflict. What is at stake, therefore, is not only the fate of one city, but the principle that territory is not merely a possession to be claimed like a commodity. It is bound up with human dignity, and to treat it as a mere asset is to erode the very idea that people and place exist in a relationship, built on more than force when the world responds. To a seismic event like Israel's plan to take over Gaza City, the reactions are not uniform, nor are they accidental. They emerge from layers of history, ideology, and strategic self-interest, shaped by each nation's unique position on the global stage. And while the differences may seem purely political, they reveal something far deeper about how humanity processes moral crises. The responses can be roughly grouped into three forms: loud condemnation, cautious diplomacy, and calculated silence, each carrying its own set of implications. There are those nations and leaders who rush to issue strong, uncompromising denunciations. Their language is sharp, urgent, and filled with moral certainties. They position themselves as the guardians of international law, the defenders of the oppressed, the voices of justice in a turbulent world. For them, this event becomes a stage upon which they can reaffirm their commitment to principles they believe should be universal: the sanctity of borders, the rights of civilians, the necessity of restraint in the use of force. But condemnation is not only about moral alignment, it is also a performance for both domestic and international audiences. It signals virtue to allies, secures credibility among like-minded nations, and shapes how history will record their stance. In contrast, there are those who proceed with extreme caution. They issue statements wrapped in the language of balance, urging all sides to show restraint, avoiding any unqualified support or criticism. These are often nations with vested interests in maintaining relationships with both Israel and the Arab world, countries whose economic, military, or diplomatic ties would suffer if they leaned too heavily toward either camp. This cautious diplomacy is not necessarily cowardice. It can be a calculated attempt to preserve influence, to keep open channels of communication, or to position themselves as potential mediators in the future. Yet such careful neutrality also risks appearing as moral indecision, a reluctance to confront wrongdoing when clarity is most needed. And then there are the silent ones, those who say nothing at all. Their absence from the conversation can be more revealing than any speech or statement. Silence can mean many things: a quiet endorsement, a fear of retaliation, an unwillingness to antagonize powerful allies, or a calculated decision to wait and see how events unfold before committing to a position. But in moral terms, silence is never neutral. In the eyes of the watching world, it can be read as complicity. It's a tacit approval of whatever outcome is most advantageous to the silent party's interests. Each of these responses can demand cautious diplomacy and silence, sends a signal. They shape the political atmosphere, influencing not just the immediate conflict but the global standard for how similar situations will be judged in the future. And whether intended or not, these reactions become part of the moral ledger that history will one day examine when it seeks to understand what the world truly valued when confronted with a moment of such gravity. The fractured nature of the world's response to Israel's plan to take over Gaza City is not a sign of mere disagreement. It is a reflection of a deeper, structural division in how different parts of the globe define justice, interpret power, and measure moral responsibility. the world is not one unified moral community. It is a mosaic of perspectives shaped by history, geography, culture, and strategic necessity. And in moments like this, those differences are not just visible, they are magnified. In the West, the reaction often fractures along internal ideological lines. On one side are those who see the plan as a clear violation of humanitarian principles, a breach of the norms that are supposed to govern international behavior. They argue with a moral vocabulary rooted in post-World War II ideals, the sanctity of borders, the protection of civilian populations, the belief in negotiated settlement over military conquest. On the other side are those who frame the issue in terms of national security, counterterrorism, and the right of a state to defend itself against perceived threats. These divisions do not simply reflect policy differences. They reflect fundamentally different conceptions of what justice demands in the face of conflict. The debate becomes not only about what should be done, but about what justice actually is. In the East, particularly among major powers and emerging economies, the calculus is often more pragmatic. Here, the primary lens is strategic interest. Responses are carefully measured against the potential impact on trade routes, resource access, military alliances, and regional stability. This does not mean that questions of morality are absent, but they are frequently subordinated to questions of national advantage. Leaders in these regions may publicly call for peace and stability, but their private decisions are guided by cost-benefit, analyses rooted in their own geopolitical position. For them, reacting to Gaza City is not only about taking a moral stand, it is about choosing a position that will preserve or enhance their strategic leverage in a complex, multipolar world. In the Middle East itself, the reactions carry an entirely different weight. For many here, Gaza is not an abstract geopolitical puzzle, but a lived reality tied to history, religion, and shared identity. The anger, grief, and defiance expressed in this region are not simply political, they are deeply personal. The conflict touches on narratives that stretch back generations, on memories of displacement and loss, and on the persistent struggle over land that is seen as both sacred and inseparable from cultural survival. Political leaders in the region are therefore speaking not only to the international community, but to their own people, whose emotions and expectations are shaped by decades of unresolved tensions. This fractured world order means that there is no single, unified moral verdict on the situation. Each region, each nation, interprets the events through its own historical memory and strategic reality, ensuring that the conversation about Gaza City is not just about the city itself, but about the kind of world we inhabit and the competing visions of how it ought to be governed. The moral consequences of Israel's plan to take over Gaza City do not stop at the city's borders. They will ripple outward, touching conflicts far removed from the Middle East and influencing the way power is exercised and justified in the decades ahead. History has shown repeatedly that high-profile actions in one region often become reference points in others. Leaders, movements, and even ordinary citizens watch how such events unfold, noting not only what was done, but also how the world responded. Those observations shape the boundaries of what future actors will believe they can do without facing serious repercussions. When a major power acts decisively, and particularly when it does so in a way that challenges established norms, the precedent set can be profound. Other nations engaged in territorial disputes will study this moment. Separatist movements, insurgencies, and authoritarian governments will take note of the conditions under which force can be used to claim land and authority. If the seizure of Gaza City is perceived as successful and met with little meaningful resistance from the international community, that perception will become part of the strategic calculations in faraway places. From Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia to Africa, the implications are not limited to governments and military planners. Political movements around the world, both nationalist and revolutionary, will interpret this event as a signal about the balance between power and principle in the modern era. Some will see it as proof that might still makes right, that moral arguments are secondary to strategic realities, Others will take it as a warning that the rules they thought were universal are, in fact, negotiable when enough force is applied. In either case, the impact on the moral climate will be real and lasting. Democracies are not immune from this shift. Citizens in free societies may find themselves questioning whether the values they have been taught about human rights, about the sanctity of civilian life, about the importance of diplomacy over violence, are truly upheld in practice. If they see inconsistency between what is preached and what is permitted, trust in the moral authority of their own institutions may erode. That erosion is dangerous, because once the public loses faith in the moral foundations of governance, it becomes easier for more cynical, opportunistic voices to gain influence. Authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, may feel emboldened. If they perceive that strong states can seize territory and absorb populations with limited international cost, they will be more willing to test those boundaries themselves. The absence of a firm, consistent global standard will not create stability. It will invite instability as each actor pushes to see how far they can go before meeting real resistance. The moral precedent set here, therefore, is not a local or temporary concern. It will inform the political imagination of the world's most powerful and most dangerous leaders alike. The world watches power move unchecked. The question is not only about the actors directly involved in the conflict, but about every single observer, every government, every institution, every citizen who chooses either to respond or to remain passive. The moment is not just a test of military strength, it is a test of moral clarity. It's because in moments like this, neutrality is not truly neutral. To witness the use of power without limits and to do nothing is to make a choice. Even if that choice is hidden behind the language of restraint or non-interference, the human tendency to separate oneself from responsibility in distant conflicts is a dangerous illusion. It suggests that because the suffering is far away, because the decisions are being made by other people and other capitals, there is no moral connection. But the reality is that the moral norms we either defend or allow to erode in one place will shape the standards that govern the entire international system. If the taking of Gaza City is met largely with indifference, that indifference becomes part of the lesson the world absorbs. The next time in another city, under another flag, the threshold for acceptable action will already have shifted. Being a witness carries a responsibility, because observation is not passive. Every observer interprets what they see, and their interpretation influences how they act in the future. Nations that fail to speak out signal to others that the moral cost of silence is tolerable. Populations that turn away from the news or dismiss events as someone else's problem give tacit permission for similar acts to occur again. The very structure of our global moral order is built on the belief that wrongdoing must be called out, that abuses of power must be recognized and resisted. When that recognition fails, the foundation weakens complicity in this sense. It's not only about intentional support for an unjust act. It can also be the product of hesitation, of fear, of the desire to preserve one's own comfort at the expense of confronting an uncomfortable truth. Leaders may remain silent to protect trade deals, to avoid diplomatic fallout, or to sidestep domestic political risks. Individuals may remain silent to avoid conflict within their communities, or to preserve a fragile sense of security in their own lives. Yet in both cases, the silence functions as a kind of passive endorsement. The moral question at the heart of this moment is whether we believe that power should be subject to limits enforced not only by law and diplomacy, but by the collective conscience of the world. If we do believe that, then witnessing an act that challenges those limits and doing nothing undermines our own claim to moral seriousness. It tells future generations and future leaders that when confronted with a clear display of unchecked power, we're content to watch rather than to act. The fate of Gaza City is not just a question for Israel or Palestine, it is a mirror, held up to the world, reflecting what we are willing to defend, what we are willing to ignore, and what kind of future we are prepared to accept.